She had scrubbed that floor on her hands and knees for 3 winters. She knew every crack in the marble, every cold draft that slipped under the east door just before dawn, every sound the house made when it thought no one was listening. And she knew one thing more. The Duke of Ashford had walked past her every single morning for 3 years. Past her bucket, past her brush, past her red, cracked hands pressed flat against his expensive floors. He had never once looked at her face. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself she was grateful just to have a roof, just to have bread, just to have something left when everything else had been taken. She told herself a lot of things in those 3 winters. But on the night she finally wore her mother's pearls, everything she had been telling herself fell apart. And so did he. Eleanor Voss had not always been invisible. There had been a time, not so long ago that she had forgotten it, but long enough that it sometimes felt like someone else's life, when she had sat at a proper breakfast table, when a maid had brought her tea, when her father had kissed her on the forehead each morning before opening his newspaper, and her mother had hummed quietly by the window, pearls at her throat, the early light catching them just so. That life had ended on a Tuesday. She remembered that detail clearly, for some reason. It had been a Tuesday in November, gray and cold, when the solicitor came to the door. Her father had gone pale the moment he saw the man's face. Eleanor had been sent upstairs. She had sat on the edge of her bed and listened to the low, terrible sound of her father's world collapsing 1 floor below her. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. He had been gambling for years. She hadn't known. Her mother hadn't known, or perhaps she had suspected and simply loved him too much to ask. The debts were not small. They were not the kind of debts a man apologized for and slowly paid back. They were the kind of debts that swallowed a family whole and left nothing behind. Her father was dead within the year. Not dramatically, no duel, no scandal in the papers. He simply faded. Stopped eating. Stopped speaking. Let himself go quietly, the way a man does when he cannot face what he has done. Her mother lasted 6 months longer. Long enough to press a small velvet box into Eleanor's hands one evening. Long enough to say 3 sentences that Eleanor would carry with her for the rest of her life. Keep these safe. Do not sell them, no matter how hungry you are. They are the last proof that you were loved. And then she was gone too. Eleanor was 19 years old, entirely alone, and had exactly 4 options. She had counted them out carefully, the way her old governess had taught her to approach problems, methodically, without panic, even when panic was the only reasonable response. She could throw herself on the mercy of distant relatives, who had already made clear they wanted nothing to do with the family's shame. She could seek a position as a governess, but without references, without a name that meant anything anymore. That door was closed before she knocked. She could marry, but a penniless, disgraced girl in a county that knew exactly what her father had done was not a marriageable prospect. Not for anyone she would have chosen to marry. Or she could disappear. Not literally, but close enough. She could go somewhere no one knew her face. She could give a different name, not a lie exactly, she told herself, just a version of herself that had no history attached to it. She could work. With her hands if necessary. She had never worked with her hands before in her life, but she was young and she was not fragile, whatever people might have assumed looking at her. Ashford Manor was 3 counties away. Far enough. She arrived on a February morning with a small bag, a false reference she had written herself and prayed no one would verify, and the velvet box tucked deep into the lining of her coat. She gave her name as Alina Vale, close enough to Voss that she wouldn't forget to answer to it, far enough that no one would connect her to the ruined family in the north. The housekeeper, Mrs. Garrett, was a compact, efficient woman who looked at Alina the way one looks at a piece of furniture one isn't entirely sure will fit the room. "You're too slight for heavy lifting," she said. "I'm stronger than I look," Alina said. Mrs. Garrett made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite dismissal. "You'll start with floors. Everyone starts with floors." And so Alina Voss, Alina Vale, got down on her hands and knees and began. The Duke of Ashford was rarely home in those first months. She heard him before she saw him, boots on marble, quick and purposeful, the sound of a man who moved through his own house as though he had somewhere more important to be. When she finally did see him, she was on the floor of the East Corridor, and he walked past her so smoothly, so completely, that she might as well have been part of the architecture. He was younger than she had expected. Tall, dark-haired, a serious face, not unkind, she thought, just somewhere else entirely. His eyes moved forward, always forward, to whatever was waiting for him in the next room, the next obligation, the next demand on his attention. He did not look down. She had not expected him to. She was a servant. Servants were not looked at, they were used, the way one uses a well-made tool without thinking about it. She had come from the other side of that arrangement. She knew exactly how invisible a person in her position was supposed to be. She just hadn't quite realized, until that first morning, how much it would cost her to become that invisible. She learned the house the way she had once learned languages, methodically, room by room, until it lived inside her. She learned which stairs creaked and which were silent. She learned that the Duke took his coffee without sugar, that he preferred the blue armchair by the library fire to the larger one by the window, that he worked late and rose early, and that there were shadows under his eyes that suggested he did not sleep as much as he should. She learned all of this. He learned nothing about her at all. The other girls in the household were not cruel, exactly. But they were watchful in the way that people are when they sense something they cannot quite name. Alina was careful with her speech, careful with her hands, careful not to use words or references that belonged to a different life. But sometimes something slipped, a phrase, a reflex, a moment where she reached for a book left on a table and held it the way someone holds a familiar thing. "Where did you say you were from?" the girl named Patty asked her once, narrowing her eyes. "The North," Alina said. Which was true. Patty looked at her a moment longer than was comfortable. Then she went back to her work. Alina went back to hers. 3 winters. That was how long she told herself she would stay, just long enough to save something, just long enough to find a better path forward. 3 winters, and then she would figure out what came next. But the first winter turned into the second, and the second into the third, and somewhere along the way Alina stopped counting and simply kept going. Because there was something almost merciful, she discovered, about a life that required nothing of you except your labor. No one expected her to shine. No one watched her with pity or judgment, or that particular expression people wore when they saw a fallen girl. She was Alina Vale. She scrubbed floors. She was invisible. It was a small life. But it was hers. And in the lining of her coat, pressed flat and silent and secret, her mother's pearls waited. The library was the problem. Alina had known from the very first week that the library would be her undoing, if anything was. It was on the second floor at the end of the South Corridor, A long, high-ceilinged room that smelled of leather and old paper, and something else she could never quite name. Something that reminded her, painfully, of her father's study before everything went wrong. She was assigned to dust it on Thursday mornings. The Duke was never there on Thursday mornings. He rode out early, rain or shine, and did not return until noon. She had 50 minutes, sometimes a little more. For the first 3 weeks she dusted. Methodically, correctly, shelf by shelf, the way Mrs. Garrett had shown her. She kept her eyes forward and her hands moving, and she did not allow herself to read the spines. On the 4th Thursday, she read the spines. On the 5th Thursday, she took one down. Just to hold it. Just for a moment. Just to remember what it felt like to be the kind of person who read books in rooms like this. It was a volume of French poetry. She stood there with it open in her hands and read 3 pages and forgot entirely where she was, and by the time she remembered, she had exactly 7 minutes to finish the dusting. She managed it. Barely. After that, she stopped pretending she wasn't going to do it. She was careful. She was always careful. She never moved anything permanently, never left a mark, never took a book out of the room. She simply read for 40 minutes on Thursday mornings, and then she put everything back exactly as it had been and went back downstairs and scrubbed something. It was the only hour of the week that felt like herself. She had been doing this for 4 months when the Duke came back early. She heard him on the stairs, that quick, purposeful step, and she had exactly enough time to close the book and replace it on the shelf and pick up her duster before the door opened. She was at the far end of the room, her back to him, reaching up to the highest shelf with completely convincing industriousness. She heard him stop just inside the doorway. She did not turn around. "It's not Thursday," he said. She had not expected him to know what day the library was cleaned. She had underestimated him. "Mrs. Garrett asked me to do an extra pass, sir," she said. Her voice was level. She was proud of that. "One of the other girls is unwell." A pause. She kept her arm raised, kept the duster moving. "The Montaigne on the second shelf," he said. "Third from the left. It's been moved." Her hand stopped. Just for a half-second. She made herself start again immediately, but she knew with a cold drop of certainty that he had noticed. "I must have shifted it while dusting," she said. "I'll take care to put things back exactly, sir." "I apologize." Another pause. Longer this time. "See that you do," he said. And then he left. Alina stood motionless for a full minute after his footsteps faded down the corridor. Then she let out a very long, very quiet breath, put down the duster and looked at the shelf. The Montaigne was in exactly the right place. She had not moved it. She had not touched that shelf at all. He had been testing her. She wasn't sure what frightened her more, that he had noticed something was different, or that he had chosen not to press the point. After that, she was more careful. She varied which books she took down. She paid close attention to the exact angle of each spine. She was, in short, meticulous in a way that was entirely disproportionate to the act of a servant dusting a room, and she was aware of that, and she did it anyway. What she did not expect was the letters. It started simply enough. The Duke corresponded heavily, with solicitors, with Parliament, with estate managers across 3 counties. The letters that came back to him were sorted by Mrs. Garrett and left on his desk. The letters he sent out were written by hand, sealed, and given to the footman each morning. One afternoon Alina was sent to his study to deliver fresh candles. He was not there. His desk was, and on his desk was a letter half written, sitting open. She should not have read it. She knew that. She read it. It was a letter to a neighboring landowner about a boundary dispute, and it was correct in its facts and completely wrong in its argument. He had misunderstood the original legal agreement. She could see exactly where, could see the precise moment in the letter where the logic took the wrong turn. It would not ruin him, but it would cost him the dispute. She set down the candles. She stood there for a long moment. Then she took a small piece of paper from the very bottom of the stack on his desk, the kind that would not be missed, and she wrote 4 sentences. Not a correction. More like a question, phrased carefully, that pointed at exactly the right part of the original agreement without telling him what to think. She left it tucked just beneath the corner of his letter, where he would find it and wonder. She was at the other end of the house before she fully registered what she had done. That night she lay awake and told herself it was foolish, and she would not do it again. She did it again. 3 weeks later, different letter, same careful anonymity. And then again. And then again after that. The Duke, she discovered through the whispered conversation of the household, had begun asking questions. Who had access to his study? Who had been in the room? He was not angry, simply puzzled, in the focused way of a man who does not like things he cannot explain. The footman was questioned. Mrs. Garrett was questioned. Eleanor stood in the hallway during that particular conversation and looked at the floor and said nothing. Mrs. Garrett told him she had no idea what he was referring to. Eleanor went back to her floors. But the silence between them, if you could call it that, between a man and a woman who had never once spoken directly to each other, was changing shape. Eleanor felt it the way you feel a shift in weather before the sky shows it. Nothing she could point to. Nothing that would have made sense if she had tried to explain it. Just a quality in the air when he passed her in the corridor that had not been there in the first winter. He still didn't look at her. But once, just once, he slowed. She had been on the stairs, coming down with a basket of linens, and he had been going up, and there was a moment where the staircase was not quite wide enough for both of them, and she had pressed herself to the side, eyes down, and he had passed, and then paused, 1 step above her. She kept her eyes on the basket. "Are you quite well?" he said. It was so unexpected that, for a moment, she thought he was speaking to someone else. She looked up just slightly, just enough, and found him looking not at her face but somewhere in the general direction of her hands. Her hands, she realized. Her red, cracked, permanently cold hands wrapped around the edge of the linen basket. "Yes, sir," she said. "Thank you, sir." He nodded. He continued up the stairs. She continued down. She stood in the laundry for a full 5 minutes afterward, perfectly still, trying to understand why such a small and impersonal thing had made her throat tighten the way it did. She decided it was simply that she had forgotten what it felt like to be spoken to. As a person. As something with a pulse. That was all it was. She was very firm about that. Second short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. It was on a night in the 3rd winter that she took out the pearls. Not to wear them. She never wore them. She simply took them out sometimes, when the day had been particularly long or the cold particularly bitter or the loneliness particularly loud, and held them in her palm and thought about her mother. She was sitting on the edge of her narrow bed, the velvet box open, the pearls catching the candlelight, when Patty knocked and came in without waiting, as Patty always did, and stopped dead in the doorway. "Where did you get those?" Patty said. They were my mother's, Eleanor said. She closed her hand around them without thinking. Patty stared at her for a long moment with that familiar, unsettling look, the one that said she was adding things up and not quite arriving at a number that made sense. Housekeepers' girls don't have mothers with pearls like that, Patty said. Mine did, Eleanor said, and her voice came out quieter and more final than she intended, and Patty, to her credit, let it go. But lying in the dark afterward, Eleanor turned the pearls over in her fingers and felt something she had been carefully avoiding for 3 years. She was tired. Not of the work. Not of the cold floors, or the early mornings, or the aching hands. Tired of being no one. Tired of shrinking herself down until she fit into a shape that had never been hers. Tired of walking past a library full of books she loved and pretending she couldn't read. Tired of correcting a man's letters in secret and watching him get credit for the arguments she had quietly fixed. Tired of being invisible to someone she had, despite every effort not to, begun to notice far more than was sensible. She pressed the pearls flat in her palm. Do not sell them, no matter how hungry you are. They are the last proof that you were loved. She had kept that promise. 3 winters, and she had kept it. She put them back in the box. She put the box back in the lining of her coat. She blew out the candle. But that night, for the first time in 3 years, Eleanor Voss let herself wonder what would happen if she stopped disappearing. Just wondered. Nothing more than that. It was enough to keep her awake until dawn. The ball had been Lady Ashford's idea. That was what everyone said, the Duke's mother, who visited twice a year from her house in Bath and swept through Ashford Manor like a warm, determined wind, rearranging furniture and opinions with equal confidence. She had arrived 3 days before with 4 trunks, a small dog, and the announcement that her son had been grim for long enough, and that a house this size deserved to be full of people at least once before winter truly set in. The Duke had objected. Quietly, precisely, with 3 separate reasonable arguments. Lady Ashford had listened to all 3 with great patience, and then ignored them completely. The invitations went out the following morning. Eleanor had not expected the ball to affect her much. Events like this meant more work, not less, more floors, more silver, more fires to lay in rooms that were never used, more everything. She had lived through 2 of Lady Ashford's visits before, and she knew the shape of them. You kept your head down, you moved quickly, you stayed out of the way of people who were dressed better than you. That was the plan. The plan lasted until approximately 8 o'clock on the evening of the ball, when Eleanor was in the small room off the kitchen that the girls used to change their aprons, and Lily came flying through the door. Lily was 17, the youngest of the household staff, and she approached most of life with an enthusiasm that Eleanor found both exhausting and, privately, a little wonderful. She was carrying something in her hands, and her face had the expression of someone who had just had what she considered to be a magnificent idea. I found these, Lily said, and held them out. Eleanor looked at what was in her hands. The velvet box. Her heart stopped. Lily, she said very carefully. Where did you get that? It fell out of your coat pocket, Lily said, already opening it, already lifting the pearls out with the careless reverence of someone who has never owned anything valuable. Your coat was on the hook, and the linings come loose at the bottom, and this just, oh, Eleanor. Oh, look at them. Put them back, Eleanor said. But Lily had already turned to her, with the pearls held open between her hands, and the expression of someone about to do something irrevocable, and before Eleanor could reach her. Just for tonight, Lily said. Just to see. You've been working since 5 this morning, and you look like a ghost, and these would be so hold still. Lily, don't. But Lily's hands were already at her neck, and then the clasp was fastened, and Lily stepped back with her hands clasped together and looked at Alina with an expression that shifted, in the space of 2 seconds, from delight to something quieter and more uncertain. "Oh," Lily said softly. "Oh, that's you look different." Alina turned to the small mirror on the wall. She had not looked at herself properly in a long time. She had avoided it, not from vanity but from the opposite, because looking meant seeing, and seeing meant remembering, and remembering was a luxury she had decided she could not afford. But she looked now. The pearls sat at her throat, warm against her skin, exactly as they had sat at her mother's throat in every memory Alina had of her. The candlelight caught them the same way. The same soft, particular glow. Alina stood very still. She looked like her mother. She looked like herself. "I have to finish the grates in the East Hall," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Take them off." "After," Lily said, already gone, already halfway out the door. "No one will see you in the East Hall anyway." And then Lily was gone, and Alina was alone, and the pearls were still at her throat, and she could hear the music starting up one floor above her. She told herself she would take them off in a moment. She picked up her bucket and went to do the grates. The East Hall connected, at its far end, to the main corridor that ran behind the ballroom. Alina knew this. She had always used the servants' passage instead, the narrow one that ran parallel, invisible, as servants' passages were designed to be. But tonight someone had left a mop bucket directly in front of the servants' entrance, and the mop itself had fallen across the narrow passage at an angle that would take 2 hands to move, and Alina's 2 hands were currently full, and it was simpler, just this once, just for 30 seconds, to go through the main corridor instead. That was all it was. A mop bucket. A small inconvenience. She pushed open the door to the main corridor. The corridor was empty. The ball was at the other end, the music louder here, the sound of voices layered beneath it. Alina moved quickly, her eyes on the floor, her bucket in her hand. 30 more feet, and she would be back in the safe, invisible dark of the servants' wing. Good God! The voice came from her left. She turned instinctively. Lady Ashford was standing in the corridor. She was dressed for the ball, silver-gray silk, white gloves, her own pearls at her throat. She was perhaps 60, with the Duke's same dark eyes and the particular stillness of someone who has spent a lifetime being in control of every room she entered. She was not in control of herself at this moment. She was staring at Alina with an expression that Alina could not immediately name, something between shock and recognition, and something older than both, something that looked almost like grief. Alina stopped walking. The 2 women stood in the corridor and looked at each other. "Those pearls," Lady Ashford said. Her voice was very quiet. "Where did you get those pearls?" "They were my mother's, my lady," Alina said. Her instinct was to apologize, to explain, to make herself small. She resisted it. "I can take them off." "I shouldn't have." "What was your mother's name?" Lady Ashford said. Alina hesitated. There it was. The question she had been careful never to invite for 3 years. The one thread, if pulled, that would unravel everything. She thought about lying. She had lied before. She was good at it by now, or good enough. But there was something in Lady Ashford's face, something raw and urgent that did not belong to the composed, elegant woman Alina had observed on previous visits, that made the lie impossible. "Catherine Voss," Alina said. "My mother's name was Catherine Voss." Lady Ashford closed her eyes. Just for a moment, just long enough for something to move across her face that Alina did not have a name for. Then she opened them again, and she looked at Alina with an expression that was entirely different from anything Alina had seen from her before, and she said, very quietly, "Come with me." She took Alina to the small sitting room off the main staircase, the one that was never used during parties because Lady Ashford had always found it better for conversations that required privacy. She closed the door. She did not sit down. She stood in the center of the room and looked at Alina for a long moment, and Alina looked back and waited. "Your mother," Lady Ashford said at last. "Catherine Voss. She was from Westmoreland." "Yes," Alina said. "She played the pianoforte. She spoke French without an accent. She had a laugh that carried through walls." Lady Ashford's voice was steady, but only just. "And she was given those pearls by a man named Robert Ashford in the autumn of 1802. The room was very quiet. "Robert Ashford," Alina repeated slowly. "My husband," Lady Ashford said. "The late Duke of Ashford. Edmund's father." Alina felt the floor tilt very slightly beneath her. "They were engaged," Lady Ashford said. The word came out precise and effortful, the way words do when they have been held back a long time. "Before me. Before any of this. They were young, very young, and their families had an agreement, and then the families disagreed, as families do, and the engagement was broken. Robert was persuaded to redirect his attentions toward me." She paused. "I was not unaware of what I was asking him to give up. I told myself it was simply how things were done. That Catherine Voss would find someone else. That Robert would be content." Another pause longer. "He was. Mostly. Eventually. He was a good man, and we had a good life, and I do not say any of this to be unkind. But those pearls," she looked at Alina's throat, "those pearls he gave to her before the engagement was broken. He asked for them back. She refused. I always respected her for that." Alina could not speak. She was doing arithmetic in her head, the terrible, quiet arithmetic of realizing that the shape of your life was arranged by forces you never knew existed. "She never told me," Alina said at last. "No," Lady Ashford said. "I don't imagine she would have. Catherine Voss had enormous pride. It was one of her best qualities." She looked at Alina directly. "You have it too. I could see that the moment I saw your face." "You recognized me," Alina said slowly. "From my face." "From your face," Lady Ashford confirmed. "And from the pearls. And from the way you were standing in that corridor, as though you had every right to be there and had simply chosen not to exercise it." She was quiet for a moment. "How long have you been in this house?" Alina held her gaze. 3 years, my lady." Something moved through Lady Ashford's expression. Not quite guilt. Not quite sorrow. Something more complicated than either. 3 years, she repeated softly. "Yes. Scrubbing floors." "Among other things," Alina said, and something in her voice must have carried an edge because Lady Ashford looked at her sharply and then, unexpectedly, almost unwillingly, almost smiled. "Your mother's daughter," she said quietly. Without any question. Alina did not go back to the East Hall grates that night. She did not go back to the servants' wing either, not immediately. She sat in the small sitting room after Lady Ashford left to return to her guests, and she held the pearls at her throat with both hands and tried to understand what had just shifted in the world. Lady Ashford had said she would speak to no one tonight. That Alina should go to bed, sleep if she could, and that they would speak again in the morning. Elinor had agreed. She had been calm. She had been composed. She was not calm now. Now she was sitting in a room that smelled of beeswax and old silk, in a house she had cleaned on her hands and knees for 3 winters, wearing her mother's pearls, and understanding for the first time that there were invisible strings running through her life that she had never known to look for. She was so deep inside this thought that she did not hear the door open. She did not hear the footsteps cross the room. She only became aware that she was not alone when someone said, quietly, "I've been looking for Mrs. Garrett. I thought this room was." She looked up. The Duke of Ashford stood in the doorway. He was dressed for the ball, black coat, white cravat, the particular formality that made him look, as always, like a man carrying a great deal of weight with practiced ease. He had clearly just come from the ballroom. There was a slight flush of warmth in his face, the sound of the music still faint behind him. He was looking at her. Not past her. Not through her. Not in the absent, architectural way he had looked in her direction for 3 years. At her. She did not move. She did not look away. She was too tired suddenly for any of that. Too tired of disappearing. She sat in the candlelight in her plain dress with her mother's pearls at her throat, and she looked back at him and she waited. Something shifted in his face. She watched him take in the pearls. She watched him take in her face, her actual face, the one she had been keeping carefully pointed at floors and walls and the midpoints of rooms for 3 years. She watched him try to place something that was just at the edge of his understanding. "You," he said slowly. "You're the girl from the East Corridor. You're the one who," he stopped. He looked at the pearls again. His expression changed. "Those pearls," he said. And his voice, for the first time since Elinor had known him, had lost its certainty. "I know those pearls." "Yes," Elinor said quietly. "I imagine you do." He did not move from the doorway. That was the first thing Elinor noticed. He had gone very still, the way a man goes still, not from calm but from the opposite, from something moving too fast inside him to allow any outward movement at all. His hand was still on the door frame. His eyes were still on the pearls. Then they moved to her face. "Who are you?" he said. Not unkindly, but with a directness that made it clear he was done with whatever the last version of this conversation might have been. He wanted the truth, and he wanted it now, and he was. Elinor understood in that moment, a man who could tell the difference. She had been careful for 3 years. She had been strategic and quiet and invisible and careful, and it had kept her safe, and it had kept her fed, and it had cost her something she didn't have a name for yet but could feel now, sitting in this room, like a splinter finally working its way to the surface. She was so tired of being careful. "My name is Elinor Voss," she said. "Not Vale. Voss. My father was Thomas Voss of Westmoreland. My mother was Catherine Voss, who was Catherine Hartley before she married, and before that she paused, just briefly, she was engaged to your father." The silence that followed was the loudest Elinor had ever sat inside. The Duke did not move. His expression did not collapse or erupt in the way she had half expected. It simply reconfigured. Like a man rearranging the furniture of everything he thought he knew about his own house. "My father," he said. "Yes. And my mother." "She knows," Elinor said. She recognized the pearls. "We spoke tonight, just before you came in. She asked me to wait until morning too." "How long?" he said. His voice had gone very quiet. "How long have you been in this house?" Elinor held his gaze. 3 years. She watched that land. She watched him absorb it. 3 years, 3 winters, 3 years of east corridors and library dust and cold marble under her hands. And she watched something move through his face that she could not entirely read. It was not one thing. It was several things at once, arriving in a complicated order. 3 years, he repeated. Yes. Working as a housemaid, Eleanor said. Plainly. Without apology. I scrubbed your floors. I laid your fires. I cleaned your library on Thursday mornings. She paused. I also corrected your letters. That was not part of my official position. Something flickered in his expression. That was you. Yes. The boundary dispute letter. And 3 others. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned away from her, one hand pressed flat against the door frame, and Eleanor could see the line of his shoulders and the particular tension in them of a man who is trying very hard to think clearly about something that is not entirely a thinking problem. You could have told me, he said. His voice had an edge now. Not anger exactly, something adjacent to it. You could have said who you were. From the beginning, or at any point in 3 years you could have. Could I? Eleanor said. He turned back. A disgraced girl with a false reference and a dead father's debts, Eleanor said. Her voice was steady. She had thought about this, in the abstract, many times. She had not expected to be saying it out loud, but the words were there, ready because they were simply the truth. No family name worth anything anymore. No money. No connections. Arriving on your doorstep with the story that my mother was once engaged to your father. She looked at him directly. What exactly do you imagine would have happened? He opened his mouth. He closed it again. You would have been kind, perhaps, Eleanor said. You seem like a man who tries to be kind, when he remembers to look far enough down to see who he's being kind to. She heard the sharpness in her own voice and did not take it back. But you would not have believed me. Or if you had believed me, you would have pitied me, which would have been worse. And I would have had nothing, no position, no wages, no roof. At least as Eleanor Vale I had those things. The Duke was quiet for a moment. That is a very logical argument, he said at last. I had 3 years to construct it, Eleanor said. Another silence. Different from the first one. Less sharp. Something else in it now that Eleanor was not sure how to categorize. He moved then, away from the door, into the room, not toward her but to the window, where he stood with his back to the glass and looked at her from across the candle-lit space between them. The library, he said. Yes. Thursday mornings. Yes. You were reading. Every week for 2.5 years, Eleanor said. The Montaigne. The Voltaire. Most of the history section. Your collection of Italian poetry is excellent, incidentally. Better than it has any right to be. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but something that wanted to be. I told you the Montaigne had been moved, he said. It hadn't, Eleanor said. I was very careful with the Montaigne. I know, he said. I was testing you. I know, she said. I worked that out on the stairs. He looked at her. She looked back. The candle between them made the room feel smaller than it was, and the music from the ballroom above was still faintly audible, and Eleanor was acutely aware that she was sitting in a room alone with the Duke of Ashford at 10 o'clock in the evening wearing her dead mother's pearls, and having what was possibly the most honest conversation she had experienced in 3 years. Why did you stay? He said. After the first winter. If it was only supposed to be temporary, why did you stay? It was a quieter question than the others. Less edge. More something else. Elena considered lying. Or deflecting. She was skilled at both. I don't entirely know, she said, which was the most honest answer she had. He nodded slowly, as though that answer made sense to him in some way that a cleaner answer would not have. I need to think, he said. Yes, Elena said. I imagine you do. I'll ask Mrs. Garrett too. You should be given different quarters tonight. Not the servants' wing. It wouldn't be, he stopped. Reorganized. It wouldn't be appropriate. Given what I now know. Elena felt something tighten in her chest. Not gratitude exactly. Something more complicated. I'm quite comfortable in the servants' wing, she said. I've managed 3 winters there. Elena, he said. It was the first time he had used her name. Her real name. They both heard it. Neither of them moved. I'll speak with my mother in the morning, he said more carefully. And with you. If you're willing. I'll be here, Elena said. I've nowhere else to be. She meant it simply, as a statement of fact. But something in it must have struck him differently, because he looked at her for a moment with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Something open. Something almost unguarded. Something that looked like a man seeing a thing clearly for the first time and being quietly undone by it. Then he nodded once and left. Elena sat in the empty room and listened to his footsteps fade down the corridor. She did not sleep. She lay in her narrow bed in the servants' wing. She had refused the different quarters, quietly but firmly, when Mrs. Garrett had appeared at her door with a confused and carefully neutral expression, and she stared at the ceiling and listened to the ball wind down above her. The music stopped around midnight. The carriages began pulling away shortly after. By 2 o'clock the house was quiet. She thought about her mother. About Robert Ashford, a man she had never met, who had given a young woman pearls in the autumn of 1802 and then been turned in a different direction by his family's hands. About the way Lady Ashford had said Catherine Voss had enormous pride, not as a criticism, but as a tribute. About the invisible machinery of other people's decisions that had arranged her life into this particular shape, without ever asking her opinion. She thought about the Duke standing in the candlelight saying her name. She pressed her fingers against the pearls at her throat. She hadn't taken them off. She wasn't sure she could. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, she arrived at a decision. She was leaving. Not in a panic. Not dramatically. But clearly and soon, and of her own choosing, before any further conversations happened in which she might be managed or pitied or handled, however kindly, by people who had the power to do so. She had survived 3 years on her own terms, more or less. She would survive whatever came next on her own terms as well. She was good at starting over. She had done it once. She could do it again. She told herself this firmly, several times, until she almost believed it, and then she closed her eyes and waited for morning. Morning came gray and cold, as November mornings do. Elena was dressed and had her bag packed before 6. It was not a large bag. It had not been a large bag when she arrived, and 3 years of a housemaid's wages had not expanded it significantly, though the wages themselves, modest, saved almost entirely, spent on almost nothing, were tucked carefully inside. Enough to get somewhere. Enough to begin. She put the velvet box in last. She carried her bag to the top of the servants' stairs and then stood there for a moment, looking down the corridor. The house was gray and quiet in the early light, the way it always was at this hour. She knew this light. She knew this quiet. She knew the way the east corridor would look right now, the pale November morning coming through the tall windows, the marble floor catching it. She had always thought privately that it was the best hour in the house, before anyone else was awake, when it was just her and the quiet and the cold light, and for a few minutes the whole enormous place felt somehow like it belonged to anyone who happened to be standing in it. She picked up her bag. She went down the stairs. She was in the main hallway, 15 feet from the front door, when she heard him. "You're leaving." Not a question. He was standing at the entrance to the corridor that led to the library, still dressed from last night, and it was evident from the look of him that he had not slept either. His hair was not quite in order. His cravat was gone. He looked, Alina thought, startlingly human. "Yes," she said. "Because of last night." "Because it's the sensible thing to do," she said. "You'll speak to your mother. You'll feel obligated. She'll feel guilty. Between the two of you there will be a great deal of kindness directed at me, and I find I would rather—" She stopped. "Started again. I have managed on my own before. I prefer it." "That is," he said, "without question, the most exhausting thing I have ever heard." She blinked. "You have been managing on your own," he said, moving out of the corridor doorway now into the hall, "for 3 years in my house, correcting my correspondence and reading my books and freezing in my servant's wing, and your response to the discovery of all of that is to pick up your bag at 6 in the morning and disappear again." He stopped a few feet from her. "How many times are you planning to disappear, Alina?" "As many times as necessary," she said. "It's not necessary this time," he said. "You don't know that." "I know that I have spent the entire night," he said, with the precision of a man who has been organizing his thoughts for hours and has finally gotten them into order, "thinking about a woman who scrubbed my floors for 3 years and never once asked me for anything, who corrected my letters and never signed her name, who read my books on Thursday mornings with the discipline of someone who knew she only had 40 minutes and intended to use every one of them." He paused. "I know that I walked past you every morning for 3 years and didn't look, and that is—" Something shifted in his expression. "A failure I intend to spend a significant amount of time making up for, if you will allow it." Alina stood very still. "I am not a charity case," she said. Her voice was not quite steady. "No," he agreed. "You are possibly the least charitable case I have ever encountered." Another pause. "Quieter now. You are also the only person in this house who has ever told me the truth consistently, even when I wasn't aware it was happening." "I corrected your letters anonymously," Alina said. "That's not exactly." "You told me the truth on those stairs," he said. "A year ago. Do you remember?" She looked at him. "I asked if you were well," he said. "You said yes. But the way you said it," he stopped. Something in his face that she was only now learning to read. "I knew it wasn't entirely true. I knew it, and I walked up the stairs anyway, and I have thought about that moment more times than I can account for, and I have never been able to explain why, until last night." The hallway was very quiet. Outside, the November morning was beginning to lighten, just barely at the edges. Alina looked down at her bag. Then back at him. "You are doing exactly what I said you would do," she said. "You feel obligated." "I feel a great many things," he said. "Obligation is the least interesting of them." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. Steadily. With the same focused attention he brought to everything, except that now it was directed entirely at her face, her actual face, and Alina found she did not know quite what to do with being seen that clearly after so long of being invisible. "I have no family name worth anything," she said. "Not a protest. Just the facts laid out. No dowry. No connections. My father's debts are a matter of record. Anyone who looks into my history will find." "I know what they'll find," he said. "I spent the hours between midnight and 4 making sure of it." He paused. "I also found that your father's boundary dispute with the Whitmore estate, the one that contributed significantly to his financial ruin, was based on a falsified survey document that the Whitmore family commissioned themselves." He let that sit for a moment. "My solicitor will be writing several letters this week." Alina stared at him. "You had your solicitor investigate my father's debts," she said. "Between midnight and 4 in the morning." "I had him available," he said, with a slight lift of one shoulder. "He is used to unusual hours." "That is," Alina stopped. "You cannot simply—" "Alina," he said quietly. She stopped. "Put down the bag," he said. She looked at the bag in her hand. She looked at him. She looked at the front door, 15 feet away, the gray November morning beyond it, the road that led away from Ashford Manor in both directions. She had walked up that road 3 years ago with a small bag and a false name, and a velvet box sewn into the lining of her coat. She could walk back down it now. She was good at beginning again. She had proven that. She stood there in the thin morning light and felt 3 years pressing down on her. 3 winters, cold floors, Thursday mornings in the library, letters corrected in secret, a staircase, a question, "Are you quite well?" The sound of boots on marble always moving forward, always past. She set the bag down. It made a small sound on the marble floor. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, in the tone of a man who is choosing his words with more care than he has perhaps ever chosen anything, "I walked past you every morning for 3 years. I did not look. That was my failure. Not yours. Not anything you carried or hid or managed on your own." A pause. "I would like, if you will permit it, to spend a great deal more time looking." Alina stood on the marble floor she had scrubbed on her hands and knees for 3 winters. She felt the pearls at her throat. She thought about her mother, about a young woman in 1802 who had refused to give them back, who had kept them through everything, who had pressed them into her daughter's hands at the end and said, "They are the last proof that you were loved." She looked at Edmund Ashford standing in the gray morning light of his own hallway, with no cravat and disordered hair, and the look of a man who has been awake all night and intends to be honest about why. "You should know," she said, "that I have opinions about your Italian poetry collection." Something in his face shifted. That thing that wanted to be a smile. "Closer now." "I was rather counting on it," he said. The wedding was small. That had been Alina's condition, stated plainly and without negotiation on a Tuesday morning in December, while Edmund's solicitor sat across from them, both with the expression of a man who had learned, in the past 3 weeks, that the future Duchess of Ashford approached most things the way she had approached 3 years of housework, efficiently, without sentiment, and with a precision that left very little room for argument. Small wedding. No announcement in the papers until after. And the servants of Ashford Manor to be invited, every one of them, through the front door. Edmund had agreed to all 3 conditions without hesitation. Lady Ashford had wept, quietly and briefly, in the way of women who have been waiting a long time to weep about something, and are relieved to finally have permission. On the morning of the wedding, Alina sat at a proper dressing table in a room that was technically already, by several legal documents hers, and she opened the velvet box for the last time as a woman who kept it hidden. The pearls looked the same as they always had. Warm, quiet, patient. She thought about her mother. She thought about a young woman in 1802 standing her ground, refusing to give them back, carrying them forward through a life that had not gone the way she had planned, pressing them into a daughter's hands at the very end, with 3 sentences that had turned out to be enough. Keep these safe. Do not sell them, no matter how hungry you are. They are the last proof that you were loved. Eleanor lifted them from the box and fastened them at her throat. She had kept them safe. She had not sold them. And they had turned out to be proof of rather more than her mother had known, proof of a history that connected 2 families across 30 years, proof that the invisible threads running through a life sometimes led somewhere neither the living nor the dead could have predicted. She looked at herself in the mirror. She looked like her mother. She looked like herself. Both at the same time, without contradiction. She was only now understanding that those had never been 2 different things. Lily cried through the entire ceremony. Patty stood very straight and did not cry at all, which Eleanor suspected cost her considerably and loved her for. Mrs. Garrett shook Eleanor's hand afterward with a grip that said everything she was far too composed to put into words, and Eleanor shook it back with the same firmness, and that was that. Edmund found her that evening standing in the east corridor. The house was full of people, quiet, warm, candlelit, and she had slipped away for a moment, the way she sometimes needed to, the way she suspected she always would. He didn't say anything when he found her there. He simply came to stand beside her and looked at the corridor with her, the marble floor pale in the evening light, long and familiar and unchanged. "Are you all right?" he said. She considered him. "You asked me that once before," she said. "On these stairs. About a year ago." "I remember," he said. "You said yes." "I wasn't entirely telling the truth," she said. "I know." A pause. "Are you now?" Eleanor looked at the floor. Every crack familiar. Every draft she had ever felt coming under that east door. Every cold morning, every gray dawn, every hour of invisible labor this corridor had held. She thought about a girl who had arrived here with a small bag and a false name and nowhere else to go, who had gotten down on her hands and knees and begun, who had kept going and kept going and kept going, because that was what you did when there was nothing else available to you, and who had discovered somewhere in the middle of 3 winters that survival, practiced long enough, had a way of building something sturdier than itself. She straightened. "Yes," she said. And this time it was entirely true. Edmund offered his arm. She took it. They walked back toward the candlelight together, away from the cold corridor, away from the marble floor, toward the sound of voices and warmth and a life that was, at last, and without any further hiding, entirely hers. Behind them, the east corridor was quiet. The floor gleamed in the dim light. Every crack exactly where it had always been. She had scrubbed that floor for 3 winters. Now it was hers. And every crack in the marble, she loved each one. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.